Judge Thomas Carter was known for his strict, almost robotic approach to the law. He'd been serving in the courthouse of the small, predominantly white town for over a decade, and his reputation was built on efficiency and fairness. At least, that's what he liked to believe. Every day, he walked into the courtroom with a quiet confidence, ready to deal with a steady stream of minor infractions, speeding tickets, petty theft, small claims disputes. He had seen it all, and ruled with a firm, no-nonsense hand. The morning's docket was filled with the usual mix of cases, but as the clerk called out the next name, something about it felt different. "Sergeant Alicia Williams," the clerk announced, her voice echoing through the room. Judge Carter glanced up, his eyes scanning the woman who stood and walked toward the defendant's chair. She was in her 30s, tall and composed, with dark, neatly braided hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, nothing to suggest her true identity, but there was something about her posture, calm, unflappable, that caught his attention. "Ms. Williams, you're here for a driving violation," Judge Carter said, his voice flat as he glanced down at the case file. "The charge: driving under the influence." His eyes flicked back to her, and he immediately assumed the worst. His court had seen its share of drunk drivers, and most of them fit a predictable mold. Alicia, however, didn't. Her demeanor didn't match the usual disoriented behavior of someone who had been drinking. She was alert, composed, almost regal. "I'd like to remind you that this is a serious matter," he continued, barely looking up from the file. "The court doesn't take DUI charges lightly." Alicia nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer any explanation or excuse, and she certainly didn't seem rattled by the judge's stern tone. The only sound in the room was the rustling of papers as the prosecutor read through the details of the arrest. Alicia had been pulled over for swerving, and a breathalyzer test had come back positive for alcohol. Judge Carter glanced over the prosecutor's notes, nodding as he processed the information. His thoughts remained focused on the legal facts. This was a clear-cut case. Driving under the influence was a misdemeanor, but it carried serious consequences. His decision was swift. "You're fined $500 for this offense," Judge Carter said, his voice leaving no room for debate, "and your license will be suspended for 6 months." Alicia said nothing. She simply nodded, accepting the ruling with a quiet dignity. The judge didn't notice the brief moment where their eyes locked, nor did he realize that the woman he'd just fined wasn't who he thought she was. His mind was already moving on to the next case as the bailiff called for the next defendant. But Alicia lingered in his thoughts, her calm presence continuing to puzzle him as she walked out of the courtroom. Alicia Williams wasn't just another person passing through the judicial system. She was a woman who had earned her place in one of the most demanding institutions in the country, the U.S. Army. She was a lieutenant colonel, a senior officer with nearly 2 decades of service under her belt, and one of the few black women to rise to such a high rank in the military. Her story, while not widely known to the public, was a testament to determination, resilience, and leadership. Born in a modest neighborhood, Alicia grew up in a family where education and hard work were seen as the only way to break free from limitations. Her mother, a nurse, and her father, a retired military officer, instilled in her a deep sense of duty and responsibility from an early age. Alicia had always excelled in school, but it wasn't until she enlisted in the Army at 18 that she found her true calling. It was a decision that shocked some of her peers, especially because many saw her as someone destined for a career in law or education. But Alicia's heart was drawn to the discipline and challenge of military life, where she could serve her country and prove that she was capable of far more than what people might expect of a young black woman from her background. Her time in the Army was marked by numerous achievements, from leading critical missions in conflict zones abroad to securing high-level security positions at home. Alicia became known for her unwavering integrity and strategic brilliance. She was a rare example of leadership, managing to inspire her troops with a balance of strength and compassion. Despite the challenges of being a woman of color in a male-dominated field, Alicia never backed down. The praise she received from her commanding officers was constant, and her colleagues respected her not just for her rank, but for her character. But Alicia also knew what it was like to be underestimated. Time and again, she had encountered people who assumed she was only where she was because of affirmative action or some other external factor. Over the years, she developed a thick skin, but it never got easier. Whether it was in the field or in boardrooms where military leaders gathered, Alicia had often felt the weight of doubt placed on her shoulders. She had to work harder, prove herself more, and face prejudice head-on. But she had never faltered. Now, standing in front of Judge Carter, Alicia was facing yet another assumption, one she wasn't sure how to correct. She could have spoken up about who she really was, but that wasn't her style. Instead, she quietly accepted the ruling, letting her poise speak for itself. But as the courtroom filled with the usual noise after her case was closed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the judge might not have seen the full picture. The weight of her identity, the years of service, and the pride she carried in her work all felt invisible in that moment. Still, she kept walking forward. In her line of work, one had to keep moving, even when the world didn't notice. As Alicia exited the courtroom, the weight of the day's events seemed to lift from her shoulders. She had long ago learned to wear her emotions like armor, concealing the frustration and fatigue that came with living in a world that often saw her as something other than what she was. Today, the courtroom had felt like just another battleground. But this time, something was different. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she had sensed a shift when Judge Carter had handed down the fine, something in the way he had looked at her, a flicker of hesitation just before the decision was made. In the back of the courtroom, the prosecutor gathered his notes, nodding toward the defense attorney, who was preparing to speak on behalf of another client. The case was over, but for the first time in a long while, Alicia felt as though something had been left unresolved, a question hanging in the air. As she waited for the courtroom to empty, she overheard a conversation between the court officer and one of the lawyers who had been in the room. "You know who she is, right?" the lawyer said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Of course, Alicia Williams. She's one of the highest-ranking officers in the Army, a lieutenant colonel." The officer shook his head. "It's incredible. I've heard she's seen more combat than most generals. And to think she was just fine like any other person." Alicia froze in place, her hand on the door. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place. The prosecutor, the judge, the entire courtroom had seen her as just another defendant, a woman who had made a mistake. They didn't know who she was, didn't understand the weight of her experience. She had worn civilian clothes, like anyone else. But in that moment, she realized how different the situation might have been if they had known she was a decorated military officer, someone who had led troops through war zones and made decisions that affected the lives of hundreds of people. As the room continued to murmur, Alicia exhaled deeply, her shoulders tense. It wasn't the fine itself that bothered her. It was the dismissal of her identity. She had spent years building a career, earning respect, and here, in this small courtroom, she was reduced to a statistic. Her achievements meant nothing in the eyes of those who had judged her that day. Alicia paused for a moment, allowing herself a brief moment of frustration before collecting her thoughts. She could handle this. She had handled worse. But it was clear that the judge hadn't yet seen the full picture. She wondered, did he even realize the mistake he had made? She walked out of the courtroom, the door closing quietly behind her. The world outside was the same as it had been when she entered, but something had shifted within her. This wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. After Alicia had left the courthouse, Judge Thomas Carter couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had been off about the case. He'd seen thousands of cases over the years, but there was something about her that stuck in his mind. It wasn't just the fact that she had accepted the fine without protest. It was the way she had carried herself, so composed and dignified. It was almost as if she wasn't bothered by the ruling, as if she had expected it. But why? Why would someone with such calmness in a situation like this care so little about a fine? The judge tried to move on, but the image of Alicia's face stayed with him. She hadn't fit the usual mold of a traffic offender, unruly, defensive, or apologetic. Instead, she seemed as though she were used to situations like this, as though this moment didn't define her. That thought lingered with him as he moved through his routine. His attention, however, kept drifting back to her unwavering composure in stark contrast to the anger or guilt that typically followed a DUI charge. That evening, Judge Carter found himself browsing through the court files of the day's cases, but his mind kept returning to Alicia Williams. Something about her name seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. Then it hit him. Her name had come up before, in passing conversations with colleagues who had discussed her military service. He remembered now. She wasn't just a civilian. She was Lieutenant Colonel Alicia Williams, a decorated officer with over a decade of service in the U.S. Army. Judge Carter's heart skipped a beat. Lieutenant Colonel. The weight of those words sunk in. She had been in the military longer than most people in the courtroom had been alive. And yet here she was, in front of him, just another defendant, a woman who had been handed a fine without anyone realizing who she really was. The realization struck him hard. He hadn't asked the right questions, hadn't taken the time to understand her before making a quick judgment. The military background, the leadership experience, he had missed it all. The judge's hands clenched around the edge of his desk as he began to feel a rising sense of guilt. How many other times had he dismissed people based on assumptions, based on their appearance, or the story they told in a few short minutes? Was this how he had ruled on other cases? Had he been fair, or had he been too quick to judge? A quiet, uncomfortable voice inside him told him that, in this instance, he hadn't been fair at all. Alicia deserved more than a fine and a quick ruling. She deserved recognition, understanding, respect. He stared at the file again. He had made a decision that day without fully seeing the person before him. But now, with the full picture in mind, he knew he had to make things right. There was only one thing left to do. The next morning, Judge Carter couldn't focus. He kept replaying the moments from yesterday. Alicia's quiet acceptance of her punishment, her unshakable composure. It was as if she had known, deep down, that this was just another day in a long line of unjust situations. He needed to make things right, but he wasn't sure how to approach it. What could he say to a woman who had achieved more in her career than he had in his lifetime? As the day went on, Judge Carter made up his mind. He decided to ask Alicia to meet with him, to offer her an apology for his initial ruling. But more than that, he wanted to understand her. He needed to hear her story, to learn who she really was, beyond the courtroom. He wasn't sure how she would respond. After all, what could he say to make up for a mistake of this magnitude? But he had to try. The following afternoon, the courthouse phone rang with a message. Alicia Williams had agreed to meet him. Judge Carter felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Was he prepared for this conversation? He knew it wouldn't be easy. But as the clock ticked closer to the time of their meeting, his nerves started to steady. This was the chance he needed to show Alicia and himself that he was willing to listen and learn. When Alicia arrived, she was still dressed in the same simple attire she had worn in court the day before. Nothing flashy, nothing to draw attention. The door clicked softly behind her as she walked into his office, and the judge stood up to greet her. He extended a hand, which she shook firmly, her gaze steady. "Thank you for meeting with me, Colonel," he began, his voice uncharacteristically unsure. "I realize now that I made a hasty judgment yesterday, and I wanted to personally apologize. I didn't know who you were, what you've done, and I'm sorry for not taking the time to understand your background before ruling." Alicia didn't respond right away. She simply nodded, her face calm but unreadable. She sat down across from him, her posture still commanding respect even in the small, unassuming room. The silence stretched for a moment before she spoke. "I understand why you made the decision you did," Alicia said quietly, her voice even and steady. "I've had people underestimate me my whole life. But that doesn't make it right." Judge Carter's heart tightened at her words. He could see that she wasn't angry, just resigned. She had heard it all before. He had assumed that because of her appearance, she was just another person in trouble, someone he could treat like everyone else in his court. He had been wrong. I've spent my life proving that I'm more than what people see on the surface, Alicia continued, her eyes meeting his. But not everyone takes the time to look deeper. Not everyone is willing to see beyond the uniform, or the skin, or the gender. The words stung, but they also opened something inside him. Something that told him this meeting was just the beginning of a much-needed shift in his perspective. He realized, with a deep sense of humility, that this conversation was the most important one he had ever had. Judge Carter sat in his office long after Alicia had left, the weight of their conversation lingering heavily in the air. It had been a quiet, powerful exchange, one that had uncovered truths he hadn't fully understood before. As he glanced at the stack of case files on his desk, none of them seemed as important as the moment he had just shared with Alicia. Her words echoed in his mind. Not everyone takes the time to look deeper. He had been so quick to judge, to assume, to categorize her based on the most superficial details, and now he could see how damaging that approach was, not just for Alicia, but for anyone who walked through his courtroom. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the busy street below. His life had been defined by his role as a judge, a man of authority, a man of rules. He had prided himself on his ability to maintain order and dispense justice. But over the years, had he lost sight of what true justice was? Had he allowed his own biases and assumptions to color his decisions, even without realizing it? The thought made him uneasy. It wasn't just Alicia's case that he was now questioning. It was all of them. How many other people had he ruled against because of something they wore, or how they spoke, or how they looked? How many times had he been too quick to dismiss someone's story, only to later realize he hadn't seen the full picture? The truth was, Judge Carter had never really thought about these things before. He had always believed that as long as the law was followed, his job was done. But the law wasn't just about rules and regulations. It was about fairness, understanding, and empathy. And those qualities couldn't be measured by a defendant's appearance or the circumstances of a case alone. They required something deeper, something that Judge Carter realized he hadn't been giving enough attention to. His thoughts drifted back to his conversation with Alicia. She had shared stories of being a black woman in the military, of facing prejudice and doubt from the very people who should have been supporting her. And yet, despite all of that, she had risen through the ranks, earning respect through hard work and an unshakable sense of purpose. It was a testament to her strength, and a reminder to him that there was far more to every individual than the label society placed on them. Judge Carter ran a hand over his face, a sense of guilt rising within him. He couldn't undo the past, but he could learn from it. He could change. He could listen more, judge less, and most importantly, take the time to understand the people who came before him, not just as defendants, but as human beings with lives, experiences, and stories that deserve to be heard. He stood up, walking toward the small window overlooking the courthouse steps. The sunlight shone through the glass, casting a warm glow on the building's stone exterior. He took a deep breath. Things were about to change. The following days brought a quiet change in Judge Carter's approach. He became more mindful in his work, paying attention to the details he had once overlooked. His usual routine, which had been dictated by the sheer volume of cases to handle, now felt different. As he sat in his courtroom, listening more carefully to the stories before him, he realized how many assumptions he had made over the years. The faces of the people who came into his courtroom were not just faces. They were lives, each one with its own complexity and depth. And he had been missing it. The next week, when Alicia's case came back into his mind, he knew it was time to take action. He made the decision to revise his ruling, not just for her, but for everyone who came before him in the future. He wasn't going to let his past judgments dictate the way he moved forward. He contacted Alicia, asking if they could meet again. He wanted to make amends and offer her something more than just an apology. Alicia agreed to meet him once more, and this time, there was a new tone in their conversation. She was sitting in front of him again, her expression still composed, but there was a subtle shift. This time, Judge Carter wasn't just speaking from the perspective of a man who had made a mistake. He was speaking from the perspective of someone who had learned from that mistake and wanted to set things right. "I've thought about our conversation a lot," Judge Carter began, his voice steady but sincere. "And I want to offer you more than just an apology. I want to correct my judgment. I believe that you deserve recognition, not only for your military service, but for the person you are. I've decided to resign the fine and the suspension of your license." Alicia listened quietly, her gaze unwavering, but her lips twitched in something that resembled a faint smile. She had expected the apology, but this offer was different. She had always been someone who believed in the power of action over words, and here, in this small office, Judge Carter was proving that he wasn't just offering words, he was offering an acknowledgement of her worth. "Thank you, Judge," she said, her voice calm but filled with a quiet appreciation. "I didn't expect this, but I'm grateful for your willingness to make things right." They sat in silence for a moment, both understanding that this was not just a simple exchange of pleasantries. It was a recognition of change, a recognition that sometimes the process of justice had to evolve. Judge Carter could sense a weight lifting from his shoulders, as though he had been given a chance to make his career, his life, more meaningful. And Alicia, too, felt a shift in her heart. It wasn't about the fine or the license. It was about being seen for who she truly was, a person of substance, of strength, and of unwavering commitment. As they stood to leave, both knew that their paths had crossed for a reason. They were no longer just judge and defendant. They were two people who had shared a moment of understanding, one that would shape both of their futures in ways neither could have anticipated. Judge Carter sat at his desk, looking out at the busy courthouse. The morning had come and gone in a blur, but his mind was still focused on the decision he had made. Over the past few days, he had taken steps to change his approach, not just for Alicia, but for the many others who would cross his path in the future. He had been determined to correct the error he had made, but now he understood that the true correction wasn't just about revising one case. It was about changing his entire perspective on justice. He had already begun implementing small changes. He spent more time with each defendant, asking more questions, listening to their stories, trying to understand the full context of their lives. He was careful to avoid jumping to conclusions based on appearances, on backgrounds, or on assumptions. Instead, he focused on the deeper elements of each case, learning more about the people who came before him, their struggles, and their triumphs. It wasn't always easy, and it required more effort than he was accustomed to, but he was committed to it. Meanwhile, Alicia returned to her work in the military, her reputation as a respected officer continuing to grow. Her leadership had earned her numerous accolades over the years, and while she had often faced obstacles due to her race and gender, she had never let them define her. Now, though, there was something different in her heart. The meeting with Judge Carter had reminded her of the power of human connection, of the importance of being seen for who you truly were. It wasn't just about the accolades or the uniform. It was about being recognized as a person of value. A few weeks after their meeting, Alicia received a letter in the mail. It was from Judge Carter. In it, he expressed his gratitude for their conversation and for the opportunity to make things right. He had gone a step further. He had reached out to other judges in the area, encouraging them to adopt a similar approach of empathy and understanding. He had even arranged a small seminar where he would speak about his experience with Alicia's case, hoping to inspire other members of the legal community to be more mindful and compassionate in their rulings. The letter ended with a simple but profound statement. "We all have stories that deserve to be heard, and I'm committed to ensuring that I hear them." Alicia smiled as she read the letter, feeling a sense of pride not only for herself, but for the change that was beginning to ripple out from that single encounter. In her heart, she knew that the road to justice wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about seeing people for who they truly were, understanding their humanity, and working to make the world a little bit more fair. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it wasn't a quick fix, but it was a start. And sometimes, that was all that was needed, a small but meaningful change to make a world of difference.